Hello, Ken Spriggs here with part 8 of my Mandalorian meets Ahsoka Tano build with diorama of the planet Corvus. Last week I left off with the completed diorama that wasn't painted yet or had any type of material, and it was just all white. So quite a bit of work, and I have completed the diorama and it looks pretty fantastic. So let me go ahead and show you all of the things I did to add on the scenic material and really make this look like the burnout, beat up, destroyed forest that it is in the episode. Let's go take a look. All right, so I used some clear resin, two-part resin that you mix together and it hardens. It's some stuff I had for a while, some older stuff, but it still worked. I thought it was probably going to be off, but it seemed to work pretty good. I used just a little bit of this translucent green. Be nice if they put some white lettering instead of gray lettering on black. This is a dye that's made for resin that you put in. I did a couple of tests and finally realized I needed just a tiny bit on the edge of a toothpick just to give it a slightest greenish tint, as you can see. I don't want it to be overly green, and I'm going to do some other things to it as well with some water effects. So what I did was I taped all around, as I showed in the previous stills, where this was going to be, and then poured the resin in. I had to move pretty quickly because it did set up pretty fast, and but it did give it kind of an odd looking ripple effect, which I like, and I like that really pale green as well. So now the beauty of it is that I can glue it on one side. I'm just kind of holding it there. I can glue it onto, say, like the right side here. Just 5-minute epoxy it onto the edge so it's permanent on this half, but not glued on the other half. And then I'll be painting that edge down inside and inside of this one as well. And then what'll happen is then when I want to put these together, it'll just slide right over top of, I'm trying to do this with one hand, it'll just slide over top of the other side and look as though it's a part of it. And then I can, you know, I'll have this painted and or have some material on it as well, so it kind of blends in naturally. But it looks like a natural little creek, and I'm going to dirty it up and make it look kind of scummy as well. But I think that's pretty cool as far as having that work out as a piece of resin. And it's one big solid piece, so that's what's nice about it as well. You can see it's still rather translucent. Some of the tape did not want to come off very well. It's stuck on it, but that's okay. The yellow kind of does add a little bit to the green, gives it a yellowish green, and you really can't see it through the top that well. A few spots, but it kind of blends in. And like I said, I'm going to do some more things on this as well, so it looks different and some weather effect or some water effects. So that's pretty cool. So that'll just go right into this spot between the two, and I can glue it onto one of them like I said, and then use that to give it a more realistic center where they match up. So okay. All right, so I began painting the diorama. The first thing I did was I put the resin water that I made into the two halves, put them together, and I used a pencil to draw a line around where the water would be. Because what I wanted to do is keep it kind of light in the greenish tint. So I used a gray-green, as I showed earlier, on the inside. And then I went ahead and used flat brown on the ground underneath and on the rest of the entire diorama, including all the trees. I did not do the inside of the big rutted out log because I want to do a lighter brown inside of that as a base coat to give it a more of an accurate look. So that's my first coat. I'm going to go ahead and let that dry. Use a whole bottle, a small bottle of the flat brown. And I left it deliberately patchy in certain areas so that it would look that way. But it's not going to be brown when I'm all done anyway. It's going to be a lot more green. So I will let that dry, and then we'll go ahead and put on our next coat of some of the different colors. All right, so I went ahead and airbrushed the inside of the log with some khaki to give it that lighter brown look. And I like that combination. I also did a little bit of light variations on the trees and the log as well, using that. It's really hard to tell, but it's just slight on there. And then on the rocks, I first airbrushed them with some dark gray, and then let that dry for a few minutes. Went back with some light gray to do some highlights on them as well. And of course, I'll be doing a lot more weathering and that type of thing on all of it. So one more thing I need to do is to go ahead and do some JA green over most of the brown to give it kind of an undercoat for the mossy look and that sort of thing. And then just highlight certain areas so I don't get any on the rocks or the trees or anything like that. So, okay. All right, there we go. So those are all the base colors that I'm going to put on for the moment. And I used the JA green as the main color over the brown because I wanted to have that mossy look. Then I went over it again with a light misting of some gray green, the same one that I used in the middle for the creek. So that'll kind of tie those colors together a bit. And now you can see how the wood color kind of pops, and so does the gray. They're starting to show up against the green as being a different color, as opposed to just all being dark brown. And so I don't really pick darker colors because the methods that I'm going to use to lighten them up, like the weathering powders and the moss and that kind of thing, I want to start with a green base and then lighten it up and that sort of thing. So, okay. All right, and so here are most of the materials that I'm going to be using. I may also be using like some oils for weathering, maybe a little bit of my Tamiya weathering powders. But the main elements that I want to use here, a lot of the general themes are going to be the same. Some different shades of mosses all over pretty much everything. A lot of scraggly branches and things that are knocked down, and it's just a really, really messed up forest. And it's also going to have some burnt look to it as well. Certainly some of it had burned at some point before the moss grew over it. So the main things I'm going to start to put down are going to be these three different mosses. This one I already had. I got it in a bag with some trees to make, and it's a little thicker and it's a darker kind of moss, so I can use that as kind of some larger pieces. Then I have some green grass fine turf, and I have some burnt grass coarse turf. And I have the glues materials to put it down and adhere it onto the, like a scenic cement and that sort of thing, to put it onto the different areas. I also have left over from my Predator POD build some of these materials that are a little more obvious. So we'll see. I want to limit how much of this I use. I don't want it to be out of control. This isn't really a jungle, it's a forest, so it's going to be more of those kind of images and tones. And then I have this as well, which I also used on my Predator POD build, which I really liked. It's dry vines, dead foliage, which is really cool. So that looks really neat. And I can definitely put a lot of this around the trees, and I will use a lot more of this as well on there. And then in addition, I have these little wood logs, which I believe are real wood. I'm pretty sure I bought them as scenic material to put onto it, but these would be nice to show like broken branches and have them lying around the ground as well. So, all right. And then something I want to try, now I've used these before, but I haven't used these colors. I get these at my local hobby shop from a company called Monroe Models. I haven't seen them anywhere else, but they're really cool. They're really thick pigmented powders, and you really have to be kind of cautious how you use them. But I have this grubby green to just bring up a lot of these colors of the green. Some ash gray, obviously, for obvious reasons, to make a lot of that look kind of burnt. And I might also use one that I had already, which was this dusty brown. I may put a little bit of that somewhere as well. Got to get that in the light. So really nice powders, but really pigmented. I want to experiment with some ideas. I've seen different YouTubers use like an alcohol spray over top of it to seal it on, because that's the biggest thing, is it just goes everywhere and it comes off again on your hands, and I don't want it to be doing that. So, okay. So these are the main materials that I'm going to be using. So I'll start to map this out a bit and figure out how I'm gonna, or where I'm gonna put these onto it, and then we'll start doing some of this material. I also want to look at some of my oils and figure out if I want to do some weathering first, like on the rocks for sure, the log inside of it, that sort of thing, possibly the trees, just to put like a dark wash on those to get some more detail out of those first also, and then start working on the rest of it. And then I'm also going to look at some things to do with the water, but we'll get to that here once we get going with some of this stuff. Okay. All right. So before I do any scenic materials, I'm going to do a little bit of weathering as far as definitely the rocks, and doing some weathering, the log itself for sure, the trees a bit. I'll try a little bit on the rest of the base and just see how it looks. And to do the weathering, I'm using Abtalung 502 oil paints, and I've used these a lot for weathering, and I've shown this in other things. Generally I'm going to create a wash, but I can make it thicker and thinner. Very pigmented oils. These are really good oils. So right now I'm starting with some Starship Filth, one that's called olive green, which should be perfect for some of these. And then I have one that's called Buff. It's kind of a tan. So I'm going to try with those at first, and then I also have 3 other ones that I want to do. One is Sepia, which is kind of a darkish brown. It's a little different color of a brown. I have a light gray, which I can certainly use on the rocks. And then I have a dust, which is also kind of a light tan as well, like the other ones. So, okay. So first thing I want to do is get some odorless thinner, and I have the 3 paints that I'm going to start with. So the first thing I'm going to start with right now is some Starship Filth, because that's my go-to as far as a dark wash is concerned. I have a paper towel here. All right. And I can bring any of these up again too, but I just want to put this into the crevices and that kind of thing. So and as I've shown before, a lot of this will dry off once the odorless thinners go away, and it'll just leave the pigments and they'll be spotty, which is what I want. Okay. There we go. And then any of the shine that's going to be on this, I can always bring down with the powders. Because I don't want these rocks to be shiny. Put it in there. Okay. All right. So I think I'll try something a little different on the trees. I don't want to do the darkest wash. So let me switch over to some of the sepia, since that's kind of in the brown range, reddish brown range, but not quite like a rust kind of a thing. All right. Actually, before I do that, let me try a little bit of this green since I have these out of here. That's nice. Okay, yeah, that's kind of cool. Bring up some of this darkness in the green to make it a little brighter. That's cool. I like that. And I'm going to let this all dry overnight so it can kind of settle in. All right, let me go ahead and change this out and then we'll continue on this. All right, so I cleaned that up. Gave myself a clean palette. So let me do a little more of the green because I really like that. Like I said, the pigments will just be what remains after everything dries off. So that'll be nice. I can always do some more of this later too. I just want to get some more green highlighted. Now I have noticed, and I don't know, you probably can't see in the camera, but there's it almost looks like some fine little hairs and strands sticking up. It's kind of almost like this lightweight clay is sort of like a papery consistency or that sort of thing. So for my purposes, it's going to be fine. It's not really going to hurt anything, but that may be a problem if you're using it for something other things that you need it to be smooth. So I don't know. I mean, mainly it's because I just painted right over it. You certainly could apply a gloss coat over this first, or you could do a like a Mod Podge. Some people do that over top of it, and that would help to seal in anything like that. So it has its benefits and it has its, you know, advantages and disadvantages for sure. You know, so just kind of keep that in mind. All right, there we go. Cool. Okay. All right, so we're gonna let that one go now. Let me go ahead and work on some, switch out again and do some sepia. All right, so the sepia I generally want to use on the wood, on like the rotted log and the tree, that type of thing. So put that in here. All right, so you can see that's kind of a really dark brown. A little bit of green still in there, but that's okay. There we go. So I like that that's more of a brown wash. Let's get a little bit on these trees. The nice thing about oils is they go on, they look like they're fairly heavy, but most of this dries off and evaporates, and then you're left with the pigments, which are really nice and strong. And they just give it a really unique look. It just gives it some character. And plus it settles down into those little lines and grooves that I've made for this, so that'll stay in there as well and act as a nice dark wash. Do some over here. And it can be lightened up as well later on using the powders and that sort of thing. So a bit more of that. Thinner. And it's okay to put these oils on thick because they will, you can take it back off. I mean, it literally takes days for it to fully set up to the point that it's not going to work anymore. So even after, you know, overnight, as I let it sit, I'll be able to go back and take off the parts that I don't want. So I do want to put it on heavy on some places, to give it this really dirty look. Okay, and I'll come back and do the other side of this tree as well. Okay, so while I have this on here, I'm going to do a little bit on the inside. So even though it's painted a different color, it'll benefit from a nice wash that will get into a lot of that detail. And I'll put some different layers of oils on there too, so, okay. All right. All right, so I'll do a little bit more work on these trees, and then I'll go ahead and do a little bit more things on the rocks and show you those. All right, so I went over quite a bit of it. I did some more green on the green part. And like I said, some of it looks bright now and a little garish, but once it sets up and I do some other things to it, it won't look that way. And same with the rocks. And none of these are going to be glossy. I'm going to go over them with some weathering powders and that type of thing and bring all that done. Here's the trees and the rotted stump. And with all of these colors that I'm using, they start dark, but that's deliberate because I know that I'm going to lighten them up. And I know especially when I put on the powders, the weathering powders, that they're definitely going to lighten that up. Like that green I showed you is a very light green. So that's going to bring a lot of this back up. Now, initially I was talking about using a flat black on the as a base color, but I obviously went with a dark brown instead because it's more of a natural color for the earth and the dirt and that kind of thing. So, okay. And I also went, if you can see down in there, I went with some of the washes in here as well on the bottom to darken that up and make it look a little more natural. So, okay. So I will let that all sit overnight, and I can do some more of that again later if I want to. But for now, that's looking pretty good. And then I can see how that sets up and go from there then. All right. All right, so one more thing I had to do before putting on any scenic material like the moss or anything like that is to glue in the little sensor for the remote control to work our lightsabers, because I want to be able to do that remote control. So I put it right there. It's a nice easy space, and it could be angled down and come right out through the bottom where I already have that opening. So I just drilled a hole diagonally. So there's the unit. It's pretty straightforward and simple. So the sensor just goes up to some place where you can hit it with the remote. You have one set goes to the power supply, one set goes to the lights. And so at this point now I can just wire in the transformer for the filaments, get this all attached in here. I probably want to do that as well, so it'll be easier to get to, and just have two wires at the very end that will then just connect into the adapter once I get the back clear acrylic frame glued onto it. So, okay. And then I'll be ready to go ahead and start putting down some bushes and shrub and things like that. So, all right. So I wired in the two leads from the remote control sensor into the transformer, which then is already wired into this little disconnect. So I just connect that together, and that'll come up through the hole here in the bottom that I was showing earlier in my videos and plug into her so she can be removed from the diorama. And then I temporarily taped the wires together on the back of the backdrop, because I'm not going to wire that in permanently yet until I'm ready to glue this onto the back of the display. And then I went ahead and plugged in the adapter into the back. So before I hot glue the wiring into the bottom of this, I want to go ahead and do a test. So let me go ahead, and here's my remote. And what I have to do is point at that sensor, and let's see what happens. And here we go. And I had already tested it. I wouldn't be filming this if it didn't work. I'd be losing my mind and going crazy. But it works fine. So she's all set to go. All right, cool. So I can unplug her from the wiring, disconnect it from the power source, and then just go ahead and get that all glued into the bottom of the base. So it's ready to go. And then I can start putting on the display. I didn't want to do any of the scenic material and bushes and stuff until I got this all glued in, because it would be kind of a hassle to get under there. Right now I just have it sitting up on some red cups so I can get and work on it. So, all right, and then we'll turn it off the remote. Here we go. Looks beautiful. All right, so I went ahead and glued the resin creek that I had made onto the left side of this diorama. And like I said, I'm only doing it on the one side, so the right side still comes loose. It's not attached in any way, but it is glued nice and solid onto the left side. And it's kind of cool. You can see underneath it, just kind of see the dirt there. So I just want that to be there to just make that connection look more natural and like it's one piece. So all I have to do is just slide them together, and they still match up just like they did before. Sorry, there we go. Doing it with one hand there. Okay, and then I want to do a little bit more on this. Obviously, it's not going to just look like that. It's going to look more like an actual creek when I get done with it. That's pretty cool. So now that that's in place, now I can go ahead and start putting down some of the different scenic material for the moss and the thickets and whatever wood particles. I don't even know what to call them, but I'll show you. I showed you earlier the different materials that I'm going to start using. So, okay, so I'm going to hold off doing any of the light green powder onto the main part until I get the other stuff done, because I want that to kind of blend it in. I like how the wood looks. I think that looks pretty cool. The rocks I can do a little bit more on, but they're looking pretty good as well. So until I do any more, until I put some more of the material down itself, I'm not going to do any more powders at this point. So, okay. All right, there we go. And so I put two different kinds of the scenic material, the burnt grass and then the lighter green grass. Some of it's coarse, some of it's fine, over the entire surface. Quite a messy job, so I put it inside of a box lid and had paper towels underneath it, and then did it that way. Mostly what I did was I took this brush, and I'm using this scenery sealer, which is like a really thinned out PVA glue. I had this bottle that's supposed to spray, but these always clog up and not work right, because you're literally putting glue through a spray nozzle, which doesn't work very well. So so what I did was I put it down pretty wet with the brush, sprinkled it on, pressed it down, you know, put a little bit more over top of it, that kind of thing, and did it around the whole thing. There's a few spots that are patchy still, but that's fine. Now, once it was all done, I really wanted to spray it, so I took this bottle, which is actually an eyeglass cleaning solution initially, and I cleaned it out really good, and then I put some of that in here, and for a limited time, I was able to get a nice, good, fine mist and spray it over the entire thing, because you definitely want to soak this in and get it to hold it all down, and let it harden in that way. So, but when I was done, I took it apart, cleaned it out really good, put some hot water in it, sprayed it out, got all the glue out of it. I think that's kind of the trick to it. And then if I need to do more, which I probably will, I can just go ahead and put some more in and go from there. So obviously these two halves come apart still. And you got the water in there. All right, so I'm letting that settle here after I sprayed it on for several hours to really set everything up. And then I'm going to move on to some of the other types of scenic material, like the dead vines and some logs and things like that. So, and some of those I'll actually use a thicker glue that I have in order to set those in place. And put them down as well. All right, but starting to look really fantastic. Definitely looking more of the green, mossy colored view that you see from the show. I showed us a screenshot before this that Mark Fraley had sent to me, and definitely shows again the idea that most of this whole area is just covered in moss, even the rocks. So I definitely put some other moss onto the rocks as well. So a lot of them are even pretty well obscured, and some moss onto the logs, the trees, that kind of thing. So, all right. So I'm using this This glue adhesive Hobby Tech, I believe. Hobby Tack, sorry, from Woodland Scenics. Same company that made the greenery here. And this is a much thicker tacky glue and has a little brush. It's easy to apply. So this works well for adding on these branches, which I got in a pack as well. And I'm just gluing some on some different places here just to kind of add a little more detail. So, okay. And then once that's done, I'm going to go ahead and go back and put on a lot of this. Dry vines and dead foliage, which is really pretty cool. And I'll probably do the same thing, put a nice pool of that, stick some of this into it. And that looks really cool. Okay, and just add a lot more detail in different places on this, on these two halves. All right, there we go. So I added quite a bit more debris. I put a lot of the dead vines and foliage inside of the log. Excuse me. Some around it. And then I put various places where I have some of the little dry, dead kind of leaves and that sort of thing over it as well. So, all right, so I will let that sit right now, let that dry in, and I'll go ahead and work on the second half. And then let those set up, put a little bit more spray glue over the top just to cement it all in, and then we'll see if I need to add anything else. All right, and here's the left half. I pretty much finished as well. And I also used a pipette to, I put some of the scenic cement into a cup and just took some out and just applied it in certain places. Excuse me. Especially where I had like the wood chips and things like that. And really added a lot of extra terrain on there. Now on the water here, I want it to be all grimy and dirty, so I took some of the weathering powders, the grubby green and the gray ash or ash gray, and I just used a brush and put some onto it. And then I went back with my little spray bottle with just some alcohol in it, sprayed it down, and that'll hopefully kind of get that to adhere on there and make it look rather grubby. So, okay, so I'm going to let this sit as well. I'm going to let both of these halves just sit and really set up overnight. And then we'll go back and look at it and see if there's anything more I need to add. But coming along really, really well. All right. All right, so the resin water that I glued down, I took some of my weathering powders, some of the ash gray and the grubby green, and I had rubbed it onto it and sprayed some of the, some of the glue got on it, some alcohol over it to kind of dry most of it. Then I went ahead and I used this material called Water Waves, which is a water effect. It's a really thick gel, and it goes on. And once it starts to set up, you can kind of move it around and make waves. But what I did was I put some of these powders down into it to make it look really grungy and disgusting, because this dirty burnout forest would obviously have a really crappy looking creek running through it. If it had a creek running through it still, it would have a lot of debris in it. So I'm letting that set up. I put it on pretty liberally, and I took it over the edge of the side that's glued on and just kind of took it all the way to the edge of this side. Some dripped off a bit, which is no big deal, where it's going to match up with the other side of the diorama. So this stuff takes a while to dry, so I'm going to let it sit overnight and harden it into place. But I think that looks really cool, and it has some more of the different colors. Once I put that on as well, I just dribbled a little bit of powders over top of it, of some of them, and worked a little bit of them in, swirled it around a little bit. But I think that'll look pretty good. And I like how it goes with the rest of the green. It looks natural as far as a crappy looking creek. So, okay. I might even throw in a little bit of this type of wood chip material. We'll see. Let me play with that a little bit and see if I can put that in there as well. All right, there we go. So I put some of this dry, dead foliage, the really loose stuff right there, which looks like dead leaves and that kind of thing. And I just sprinkled it in over top. Let it kind of settle down. And that looks pretty cool. And it'll still maintain a shine once it dries. So it'll still give you the idea of it being water as opposed to being the ground. But I think it'll give a nice little touch there and disguise that middle seam. So, okay. So we'll let that set up. There are a few spots that I can kind of fill in, like you can see right about here. A few little spots like that. There's a few on the other side. But they don't have to be perfect. That's kind of the idea of painting underneath it with the darker colors and the browns and the greens, so that any spotty, places underneath it would not be showing through with the green foam. If I had just put this over the green foam, it would have been a lot harder to try to mask it all and cover it all. So, all right, so I'm gonna let that set up, do a little bit more touching up, and then we should be ready to start gluing the back drops onto the backs of these. Okay. All right, so I'm putting in some aluminum tubing into these backdrops, the acrylic frames that will go into these holes. You can see one right there. I was going to do 3 at first, but it's really hard to finagle them in, so I just did 1 on each end, and there's a hole to correspond it. And I made the hole larger than it needs to be so I can work them in. And then first I used CA glue to glue it into the acrylic frame. I drilled a hole through it. And then I shored it up on the inside with some 5-minute epoxy. And then I took my Dremel with the cutting wheel and I just scored a bunch of really deep grooves into the acrylic to give it something to bite onto with the 5-minute epoxy. That's how I'm going to ultimately glue these onto the back of these. Now, what I'm doing right now is there's a considerable gap in between where these are on this end. The end in the front goes on nice and snug, and on this side as well. This one has more of a pronounced gap in these two areas than the other one does, but there's still a little bit of a gap, and there's an area where some of the wood, like you can see that wood there is coming out further than this backdrop, but up here it is not. So what I want to do is take this epoxy sculpt and I'm going to press it on the inside, press it out, and then push this against it. I'm going to put some tape on the inside of where the acrylic is so it doesn't harden onto the tape. I just want to have a nice flat, and I'm going to flatten it in this area here, because the rest of this is going to be filled with epoxy. And I might make a little piece that comes up here too, like a dam, and over in this side, and then over here too. Just so I can pour a ton of epoxy in there and just really fill that up, and also put some on the aluminum tubes that are going to go inside there. So, all right. And then once that hardens overnight, I'll be ready to go ahead and get these backdrops glued onto the back of the bases. And it's important because I want these to line up with each other right here where this line is, because that's being hidden by the trees, and I want it to be nice and straight. Because once these are on here, these are going to be solid, and then the two halves, of course, can come apart. But I want them to meet nice and perfectly in the middle, just like the rest of the base does. So I can put it apart and then pull it apart to look at the figures and put it back together again and have a nice snug fit. So, okay, coming down to the wire and getting ready to wrap this up as far as the diorama and have the backdrops on there as well. Fantastic. All right, so I initially got both sides glued on and got them lined up. They're very close. There's a little bit of a gap, but I can force them together. And what I've done is I've taken some electrical tape, since it's black and a light block, and just taped it on the back to hold these two in place. But it can be removed and still split them apart, which was the idea that I wanted. So there's my my battery and switch for the moon. What I'm going to do is once this fully hardens, which it's set up now, so they're stuck together. There's still a gap inside of each of these that I can pour in some epoxy from this end of it, like tilt it over and pour some in and just fill in that gap. Maybe throw a little bit of scenic material over top of it. Also a little bit of cleanup, like cutting down, sanding down this little edge here, these little bits of epoxy sculpt along the edge as well, and over here, just to clean that up. But otherwise, they're nice and solid and glued on there very strongly. I still have to wire in the wire, but I can just sit this on its back and get in there and wire that together for the adapter. So let me go ahead and turn it around, and I will show you the final reveal of my diorama. All right, and there we go. And there is my pretty much completed diorama with just a few extra things I have to do, like I said. I did go ahead and put down some more pieces to fill in some little gaps, and I put some more of the grubby green weathering powder over top of it. Just kind of put some gloves on and just sprinkled it around in different places. Went over it with a little bit of alcohol and then also some glued scenic cement to hold down the rest of the material. So there's a few little spots I can patch up, but for all intents and purposes, it is all complete. The two backs are glued in place and they're looking really magnificent. You can see the moon there that's lit up. And it actually looks kind of cool when it's in daylight. You can see how it really looks. It looks that bright and it looks that distinct. You can make out the different detail in the moon, which is really cool. You really can't see that seam in the back very well unless you look closely at it, and I'm not going to worry too much about it. Looks pretty fantastic. And I have my rotted out log that's all nasty and scummy, and some material jammed inside of it. I have my trees that are all rotted and burnt and dirty. I have my rocks that are mostly moss covered but still peeking through a little bit. Little rock where Grogu's going to sit. And then I have my my really disgusting creek going down the middle, which is also equally quite as filthy. And that certainly hides that seam when they're together. And then of course, like I said, if I want to, I can just pull these apart. In fact, the tape works kind of cool because it kind of holds them together when I pull it apart. So if I want to get a straight on shot of Ahsoka, I can do so. Or a straight on shot of Mando once I get him painted and put on, I can do so as well. And see the other material or the other part of the scenery, like the rotted log and that sort of thing. So, and you can see like the dirt, the ground underneath the water, and this part over here too. So, all right. So very happy with that. I think it looks suitably destroyed and mossy and very faithful to the image from the episode. So, okay. So I will go ahead and call this a wrap on the diorama. And very, very happy with how it's all turned out. All right, so that's going to wrap up this video for this week. So really happy with the progress and the completion of the diorama that I made. I will be working on painting up Mando and Grogu and little Moria. I'm sorry, I'll get that name right for the owl. And then next week for sure, I will be finishing up this diorama and doing the final reveal with all the figures on it, and Ahsoka and her fantastic lightsabers as well. So stay tuned for that. Thank you to all my new subscribers, and I will see you next time for the finale.